Welcome, welcome. It's the Fantasy Slant powered by Pro Football Focus and brought to you by DraftKings.com. I'm your host, Jeff Ratcliffe, back for another one, and actually a special IDP edition, or I don't know if it's that special anymore. We're going to be doing these weekly. I know you folks on Twitter who are following us out there have been asking when we bring these back on a weekly basis. Well, it begins now. Week 1 is in the books. We finally have some data points. We have a lot to go through, and we're going to be back each week. Of course, by we, I mean me and my co-host, Ross Miles. Ross, God, crazy. Every year, it never ceases to amaze me how crazy week 1 was. Did you enjoy it?
Oh, did I enjoy it? I think the best feeling, Jeff, and this sounds crazy, is waking up on Tuesday morning and knowing that I only had to wait under 48 hours until we had more football tonight. As there's not more than a 72-hour period when I know that football's not coming again. There are some great things I got to see. The Antonio Brown kick to Spencer Lanning, Des Bryant getting rocked in the back. There are so many highlights. Don't talk to me about the Rams. We're just going to pretend none of that ever happened.
And I guess I should give our typical Thursday preface to this. We are recording this right now Eastern Time. It is about 6:45. That means you're probably listening to this on Friday. We have no idea what's going to happen. And hey, if I had an idea, I might be heading out to Vegas. But I have no idea of what's going to happen tonight. So if we do mention anything and our predictions don't come true, don't hold it against us. But of course, if our predictions do come true, then give us all the credit in the world. Ross, a crazy week 1, though. And you know what we're going to do to start out this week is take a look at the injuries that really plagued the defensive side of the ball. You know, I guess I should probably preface this. You know, check out the content on the site before you would have known about some of this stuff even before the podcast if you're checking out the content on the site. Some of it's free, actually only a tiny bit of it's free. If you really want full access, you got to get that gold subscription. $24.99 gets you access to everything, and there is some insane stuff that we had this year, more than we've ever had before, and the content is elite level. And not to knock what we've done in the past, but I'm just blown away every day by what we're putting up on this site. And if you want it even cheaper, go to DraftKings, our sponsor, and sign up with them by making an initial deposit of at least $10 using the promo code PFF, and you'll get Fantasy Gold for free and a 100% deposit bonus. If you haven't gotten in on the daily craze just yet, it's addicting in a very good way, just as good as fantasy football is in general, but you get to do it each week with a whole new lineup, and we have an optimized tool that will help you out in the process. All right, let's do the injuries. Ross, I'm going to run through these kind of quickly because we could do a whole show just on this alone. So in Tennessee, obviously, we saw Zach Brown getting the every down role, and that lasted for about 3/4 of a game. He's now out for the season with a torn pectoral. And Xavier Gooden is going to be in for Brown in the starting lineup. We're not entirely sure yet if Gooden's going to have an every down role. He didn't have an every down role in week 1. That's not to say he won't in week 2, but I'm going to hedge towards him only maybe seeing some nickel snaps, which means good things for Wesley Woodyard if you're a Woodyard owner and you're a little concerned about what happened in week 1. In Dallas, Justin Durant now injured. So the injury bug strikes again. Looks like he'll miss about a month with a groin injury, and as crazy as it sounds, probably the biggest beneficiary of this, Rolando McClain, who actually really looked good in week 1. Really, I'm not kidding. He actually looked good. McClain is a sneaky guy you might want to pick up. Tons of injuries in Miami. In fact, all 3 starters out. They're going to be out this week. Koemisi with an ankle injury, indefinite period of time. Philip Wheeler, a thumb injury, kept him out in week 1, keeps him out again in week 2. Could be back soon, we're not sure. And, of course, Danielle Ellerbe on injured reserve. So what do we do? Well, Jason Trusnick is going to start in the middle with Misi out. It looks like Jelani Jenkins is finally going to get his crack at the starting lineup in place of Ellerbe. And we don't know what they're exactly going to do just yet. Jonathan Freeney, they pick up Kelvin Shepard. Who knows what that third linebacker is going to be? But you're really looking at Trusnick and Jenkins, and for me, I'm taking a flyer on Jenkins in deeper leagues, but that's about it. Maybe monitoring this in redrafts, but Jenkins should be owned in dynasty formats. In Kansas City, Derek Johnson torn Achilles, out for the season. Tough break. Josh Mwaga is going to get first crack at replacing him. Joe Mays is also sidelined there, so James Michael Johnson will be in the lineup. I think Mwaga is the best bet for your every down guy, and he probably should be owned, but nothing higher than an LB3 ceiling. The beneficiary is Eric Berry. Eric Berry could have a Barry Church-like season, so that is pretty exciting to see. Robert Mathis, if you're holding on to hope, he's now on injured reserve with the torn Achilles as well. That's a tough break for this Colts defense. No real value in the wake. It looks like Bjorn Warner is going to get a more full-time job, but you don't want any piece of that just yet. Also, Jarrell Freeman injured in week 1. Not significant, but Josh McNary did get out there and replace him. If Freeman misses any time, it would be McNary. So it doesn't look like that's going to be the case. Jadeveon Clowney out for 4 to 6 weeks after undergoing surgery to repair a torn lateral meniscus. Tough break for the Texans, tough break for Clowney. Very exciting player. It looks like, though, he avoided any major injury, so it's good to see that. He will be replaced by Whitney Merciless, so you have Brooks Reed and Whitney Merciless essentially out there in every down. Reed looks like the better player right now, and maybe an option in big play leagues. Chris Long on designated to return injured reserve with an ankle injury. Not much value to be had there. Sorry to say, Ross, this does not look good for your Rams. I'm almost done, I swear. Jonathan Cyprien concussion, Vontaze Burfict concussion. There is a slightly different league protocol this year. Haven't gotten any news on if these guys are going to be back on the field, so if you own them, you are going to want to take precaution here. Keep a close eye on their status. Nothing to be had if Cyprien doesn't play in terms of fantasy value, but if Burfict sits, Vincent Ray will get the start. He will play every down. He is an intriguing guy to start there in Cincinnati. Did I miss anything, Ross?
You didn't miss anything, Jeff, but I have a sneaky sleeper for one of the teams you mentioned, and it's going to be a guy I'm going to mention in my article that gets released a little bit later today. So I'm going to just leave that hanging there as a teaser. It's the way we've logically thought about things several times this preseason, Jeff, to do with linebacker injuries. So I've come to the conclusion that there might be some value somewhere else in one of those situations. So please check out the article a bit later, and hopefully you'll find the guy I'm talking about.
An industry tease. You got to love it, folks. Ross, with the injuries behind us, and remarkably, I can't believe I did that mostly on memory, folks. With the injuries behind us, we saw some week 1 performances, and I kind of want to just chuck these over to you, get your thoughts, maybe throw some of my thoughts in as well. In terms of whether we're buying or selling, every year we see this, and hey, I just mentioned Koamisi 2 years ago. Koamisi goes out week 1, lights it up. Everybody's picking him up. And then we find out he's just a 2-down guy, and it was against Houston, and Houston ran the heck out of the ball that year, so it was really a product of the matchup, and he really wasn't worth picking up. So, but then again, there are always situations where there are guys who we want to pick up in that after a big week 1 performance. So I'm just going to kind of throw these over to you, see your thoughts, and maybe add, like I said, add some of my own. Where we'll start is with probably, one of the more interesting situations for me, actually. C.O. Moore had a huge week 1. 13 total tackles. He had a sack. He had, 11 solo tackles. He also had a forced fumble. Now, I was asked about C.O. Moore on Twitter, and I said, this is likely C.O. Moore's biggest game of the season, but he's still going to be a solid player. Tough to top that one, but one C.O. Moore actually responded to me on Twitter saying that I'm going to eat my words. Well, CO, I hope I do. I love the shout-out. I love the banter from the players. Really awesome. But, Ross, am I going to eat my words? Well, I don't know. But do we want CO Moore? Are we buying this performance?
It's a really interesting one, Jeff, because essentially Moore got on the field because of Roach not playing. Roach was a fairly late scratch. The interesting thing is Moore's been sort of locked in a battle with Miles Burris during the preseason for who's going to sort of line up on the outside, and it looked very much like Burris was the winner of that battle. But come last Sunday, both of them played 72 out of 72 snaps. But when you look at the grading, and I know we don't use grading for fantasy purposes because we haven't really found a tangible way of extrapolating that, but grading does talk about how well a player has performed while on the field. And Miles Burris performed something like -3.5, while CMO was a +1.0. So that signifies to me, at least initially, that Moore is performing better on the field. And this is something I think many people see in Moore. They see his potential. So I think Moore could eventually beat out Burris and take that job alongside Nick Roach when he returns. I'm kind of falling in the same category as you, though, Jeff. I'm not sure if Moore's going to be the guy that gets double-digit tackles on a weekly basis. Obviously the sack and the forced fumble are boosting his numbers, but Moore is a guy I'm gonna keep a sneaky eye on. I think he's in that sort of LB3 tier right now, and there's potential for a little bit more.
Yeah, well, I mean, honestly, if he repeats that performance every week, he has 208 tackles for the season. That's not going to happen. It's really rare to see a guy put up that many tackles, at any point. Like we mentioned Eric Berry. Okay, Eric Berry had 15 total tackles this week. That was his career high. Like, you don't see this on a regular basis. And, that's why somebody like Paul Warlow, it really should be getting your attention because this is the real deal. But back to Moore, see, I kind of saw it slightly differently. I saw it as Moore winning that job and then going out with the neck injury in the preseason, and then Burris being the replacement for Roach. I don't know if we have any official word either way. So, hey, it could be one or the other. But, Ross, you're right. Moore was the better player on the field. He was the better player in coverage. His strong suit, rushing the passer, of course, he did a great job with that, getting that sack. But he was the better player on the field, so I wouldn't be surprised if this sticks. And this guy does have more upside than Nick Roach. Nick Roach may be a higher floor, but Moore is intriguing. I'm buying it. It's certainly not one of those week one flash in the pans, like maybe Leotis McKelvin. Now, Leotis McKelvin, 13 total tackles as well in week one. And I know that a lot of people rushed out and picked this guy up. Lots of Twitter questions. Ross, are you in agreement? This is a flash in the pan?
Yeah, it's a cornerback, dude. I don't care. I love cornerbacks. I love cornerbacks. We talk about it all the time. We even, as you're well aware, we had a little back and forth about McKelvin not being in my IDP waiver wire. I will never pay for a cornerback on the waiver wire. Never. I've just first come, first serve. There's so much variation from week to week. Until you can show me some hard, fast data that McKelvin's being used in a special way to make him get those tackles consistently, I am not interested. As good as he is, I like him. He's a guy that comes out really well in my rankings and comes out well in the stats I produced last year on how he's used to cover people and the points he gives up. I think he's got a lot of potential, but for me, I'm never going to spend any of my free agent budget on a cornerback ever.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this was more a product of just what the Bears plan to do. McKelvin saw 13 targets. It's pretty obvious they picked on him. And the Bears removed their wide receivers all around the field. So basically it's like, okay, Marshall, you're going to line up against McKelvin. We're going to throw it to you. All right, Alshon, you go over there. Whoever. Everybody line up against him. We're going to throw you the ball. And to McKelvin's credit, he cleaned up the tackles. But you're not going to see this every week. So please keep him on the waiver wire and don't buy into this. What about how about Stevie Brown? Stevie Brown, 9 total tackles, 6 solos. What do you think of that performance in week one?
Yeah, it was a solid one, Jeff. I mean, Brown is a player we've talked about in other podcasts because of the performance he put up 2 years ago when he had 8 interceptions and then plenty of total tackles. He is a guy who has that kind of big play upside. We both had him sort of in that mid DB2 tier, so he is a player I'm keeping an eye on. I do own him in a couple of leagues, so I was glad to see him perform. I think one of my main takeaways every week from week one is don't overreact either way to a positive or a negative performance. Obviously you want to see affirmation of the kind of your rankings and the way you've drafted, but don't get carried away. I'd like to see 2 or 3 weeks of data before I make any major moves. Now, Jeff, I know you've been asking me about players, but I want to just quickly throw one your way because I know he's a guy you've been high on, so I'm going to give you some credit. Andre Branch.
Andre Branch, that's a nice one. And I actually, of course, got to watch this game closely live, being in Philadelphia. And, boy, we saw pretty much exactly what we thought we were going to see out of Andre Branch. We saw him essentially kind of in a rotation. Hey, not a big surprise. Gus Bradley coming from that Seattle defense, heavy rotation along the defensive line. Hey, Cliff Averill owners, keep that in mind. But he got out there for a bunch of snaps. Now, unsurprisingly, a lot of nickel in against Chip Kelly and the Eagles. But, hey, he was productive. He was exactly what you want out of him. And, he put up another sack. What is it? Something like 6 sacks in his last 8 games or something to that effect. But the one problem I see from him is, that sort of rotational role is going to be not necessarily the most beneficial for your tackle floor. So weekly, there could be some ups and downs. He's not getting a sack every single week. He's not putting up 16 sacks this season. But could he put up 8? Sure. Could he put up 9? Maybe. I don't know about 10, but it wouldn't shock me if he puts up 10 sacks this year. I'm not going to predict that one, though, especially in that situational role. But, hey, dynasty owners, this guy he's been available in various dynasty leagues that I'm in, and I've snatched him up in pretty much every one I could possibly get my hands on because I'm going to sit on him. This guy is 10 years younger than Chris Clemens, and Clemens, hey, he's coming to the end of a great career, but he's coming to the end, so I do buy it. I am enjoying it, and it's gonna keep coming. Now, how about a player that you've touted, Ross, and give you some credit, Keenan Robinson. Certainly a nice performance there in Week 1. Not necessarily a huge performance on the stat sheet, but he looked good. And here's maybe I know you're buying him, but here's the question: are you buying him as potentially a better fantasy asset than Perry Riley? Because he did look better than Riley on the field in Week 1.
Oh, that's a tough one, Jeff. I am partial to Riley as well. I think the thing with the Washington linebackers is we've just been waiting for someone to come in and take over from London Fletcher, who was just a stalwart in the middle with triple-digit tackles every single season. So although I do like Robinson, like I said earlier, I'm not jumping to any Week 1 conclusions. I want to see a little bit more data build up. He is a guy I do own, and obviously we talk about him being sideline to sideline. So, as long as he can keep up racking up those kind of 6 tackle games plus, he is someone that definitely should be picked up off the waiver wire. Now, I'm going to throw another one back your way, Jeff, or probably 2 actually, because these 2 guys I'm sort of bandying together, Emmanuel Lamore and Brandon Marshall, both guys who have assumed 3-down roles, slightly, maybe unsurprisingly, maybe not some more hardcore gamers, but they both had double-digit tackle games. So do you see these guys continuing in that vein?
Well, as you bang the drum for Keenan Robinson in the preseason, I probably banged it just as loud for Emmanuel Lamore. I'm buying it. The guy, if you know that he's a physical specimen, if you see he's 6'4", he's got the size, he's got the speed, that sideline-to-sideline ability. He's got a bit of attitude to him. Not that there's any NFL player who doesn't necessarily have that, but he's got that edge. This guy punched A.J. Green in practice in the preseason. It's like he's punching their number 1 wide, their stud. You got that spark. You got to love that, and he showed up. The stats crew didn't really help him in terms of the solo tackles, but what you also got to like about Lamore is that one pass defense. The guy can cover. He's no slouch. So, this is absolutely great going forward. I've been asked a number of questions about him. Where do I situate him? He's an LB3, but he's an LB3 who could, on any given week, put up LB1 numbers. So he's that super high ceiling guy that you want on your team, especially early on. And then you mentioned Brandon Marshall. Okay, hey, Brandon Marshall, is he a great football player? Probably not, right? No offense. There's no such thing as a bad football player in the NFL. But he's not an elite level guy by any means, though he is putting up some pretty impressive production. But let's keep this in mind. He's doing so in place of Danny Trevathan. Danny Trevathan is not on injured reserve designated to return. Danny Trevathan essentially is, he's healing up. He had a bone break, and he'll be back after the Denver bye, which is in Week 4. So if you're somebody who's jumped on Marshall expecting to ride this one into the sunset, you're probably going to be sadly mistaken. Yes, you'll get more good weeks out of him, but that's it from there. And Trevathan's going to be back in. And by the way, the ultra uber sneaky play right now is if somebody somehow fell asleep, either dropped Trevathan or nobody drafted him pick him up before anything comes out about him, before there's a buzz, because he's going to be a stud when he comes back if Marshall's production is any indication. And Trevathan is a superior player. Trevathan's a dynamic player. You're adding interceptions. The tackle volume's going to be there. So not buying Marshall as a long-term solution. Ross, I want to switch over to a defensive lineman who we've certainly talked about in the past numerous times, an oldie, but is he a goodie this year? And that's Justin Smith. He was an absolute animal, recording 2 sacks against the Cowboys. But do we buy this? Are we buying this out of Smith as an indication that he might be resurgent, or was this just the product of the matchup?
I'm going to side on matchup, Jeff. I mean, I love Smith. I've owned him in plenty of leagues, plenty of times over. He's one of the most underrated, or I think he's been perennially underrated. But 2 sacks, I mean, this isn't a guy that I see getting more than 10, 12 sacks in a season, so he's already chalked up 2 of them. I'm gonna go with no, Jeff. I think I'd still keep him in that low DL2, DL3 tier, despite the fact he had a pretty impressive stat day. I know one guy who I find interesting this week is Harrison Smith, mainly just because his stats are quite all over the place. An interception, which he returned for touchdown, and a sack, but only 2 total tackles. And 2 total tackles is a number that jumps out to me as extremely worrying for one of the top safeties that we're sort of relying on for fantasy football.
I'm not worried because I hate to say it, he played the Rams. That's really the only reason. I mean, there really wasn't much of an offense there, to speak of. Sorry to folks who played Kenny Britt like me in FanDuel last week, but what are you going to do with that one? I'm not worried. He showed the big play upside, and he's locked in. But, we could look somewhere else. We could go to the opposite side of the coin and say, all right, well, Dwight Lowery, he had 11 total tackles in week 1. Are we buying that?
Again, I mean, Lowry's a guy who was always sort of skirted around the fantasy circles. He's the kind of guy you see on the waiver in week 7 or week 8, and you're looking for your sort of bye-week safe, and you're like, yeah, Lowry's all right, but I could probably do better. And that's just always the feeling I get with that guy. 11 total tackles, I would have loved to be riding him. I'm almost certain if I rostered him, he wouldn't have been a starter for me. And I think that's probably what you're always going to get, unless you've got exceptionally weak IDPs because you've just stockpiled your offense. Lowry's just not going to start for you unless you're in the deepest of crazier for leagues.
Yeah, we kind of see this, he's now in the Thomas Dakoud role for the Falcons, and we saw this with Dakoud in the past. When they play the Saints, Dakoud would blow up. He'd put up double-digit tackles. He'd have an interception maybe or a forced fumble or something like that, and then he would go back to general IDP mediocrity. It's the product of the matchup, folks. William Moore is the guy to own there. But what about DJ Swearinger, Ross? 8 total tackles, 6 solos, and a sack?
Yes, Swearinger. I've written 2 articles this week, Jeff, and both mentioned Swearinger and how much I think the way he's playing in that Texan scheme is going to suit him, and he's going to be a decent fantasy option. He is a borderline waiver wire pickup in sort of normal 10, 12 team leagues. He's the kind of guy that might have snuck under the radar. If you're in if you're listening to us, you're a more hardcore gamer, and if the rest of your league is a hardcore, he's probably owned. But if you're the one in the league that takes IDP seriously, there's a chance he's there. You should definitely go and grab him. Off the top of my head, he played about 80% of run snaps in the box, i.e. within 8 yards of the line of scrimmage. This is a big thing for me this year when I'm looking at my defensive backs, especially my strong safeties. If you put up, percentages 40, 50, 60% in the box, you're going to probably have a pretty productive fantasy season. Obviously, 80% is just a 1-game total, but it's not, it's not impossible for someone to play that kind of role. Troy Polamalu in the past, even Quentin McCall when he played for the Rams. Both these guys had well over 70% of run snaps by the opposition within 8 yards of the line of scrimmage. I'm not saying Swearinger's going to have that role, but he could easily get towards 50, 60%, and that makes him a very interesting fantasy option. I think I'm going to bump him on my rankings a bit.
And also the other really interesting thing about Swearinger is the lack of real linebacker depth in Houston, at least on the inside, not on the outside, but on the inside. They don't have another 3-down guy outside of Cushing, who didn't play 3 downs in week 1, folks, but more about that maybe later on. Swearinger's a nickel linebacker. Okay, so he's got that sort of that like Brian Scott role we've seen in the past, in Buffalo, but except he's playing base downs too, so that means he's in a potentially huge situation here. I thought he was going to be a solid DB2. I was probably a little bit low on Swearinger coming into the season, and he already showed it in week one. One more player to buy or sell from week one. A player close to my heart, Fletcher Cox. I've been backing this guy for a long time. He puts up 6 tackles, all solo, and obviously scores a touchdown. Now, you're not going to score a touchdown every week, but and this is one of those reasons why you don't just look at how many fantasy points they scored. Look at the box score. Look at what they actually put up in the stat line. But the question is ultimately, are we buying this? And Ross, I'll lead this one. I'm not buying it. I've been down this road with Fletcher Cox before, and the problem with Fletcher Cox is, sure, okay, he had the 6 tackles here. But what happens in the week where he has 2 tackles, right? Now you got very minimal points. I mean, if you're at 1.5 points per tackle, you're lucky if they're both solos, and you end up getting 3 points, right? That's not good. So I'm selling it. I'm not buying into Fletcher Cox is finally having his breakout year. Ross, do you agree? You disagree?
Yeah, and I agree. I was asked several questions this week about Cox and whether they should pick him up, who they should be dropping to pick him up. And my answer was he scored a touchdown, dude. That's why he's one of the top scoring fantasy players right now. That's not going to happen on a weekly basis, just as you said. I do like him player-wise, but fantasy-wise, I'm not so sure. Again, he's in that kind of, sticking around as maybe a bench alternative if you've got a bye week or an injury. If he does put up another 5-6, tackle game next week, I might start paying a bit more attention. But I need to see some consistency of his tackle output for me to even consider picking him up.
Yeah, and you have to think that's a pretty massive output. If you're looking at defensive linemen who get up in the 60 range, what is that ultimately? I'm doing the math in my head here. 4.5 tackles a game.
Yeah, 4 tackles a game, 4.5.
Somewhere in that range. So yeah, 6 is a lot to ask, and his sack ceiling it's extremely low. So is his floor. So that's unfortunate. And Ross, just to bridge this into another topic that obviously is an important one at this time of year, is just the defensive ends in general. Every year we see this, okay? Defensive ends go out. You spend an early pick. You drafted Jason Pierre-Paul. He doesn't have a big week one. Should I drop him for an insert name here? Wallace Gilberry. Okay, Wallace Gilberry had 2 quarterback pressures. They both were sacks. As opposed to J.J. Watt, who had 10 quarterback pressures. Obviously Watt's fantastic. You own him. You're not dropping him. Please don't ever think of dropping him. But the same thing can be said for somebody like Jason Pierre-Paul. It's going to come, folks. Be patient. It's a roller coaster ride. And I'm going to throw a player over to you, Ross, who I've actually had some people asking me about. And, I guess the recent developments also impact this as well. But Robert Quinn, all right, Chris Long is out. The offense is not good. Are we nervous about Robert Quinn?
No. It's Robert Quinn. He's a player who many people right now are calling the best pure pass rushing end in the league. At what point does that guy become a problem because someone's injured next to him? I mean, Chris Long is a good player, and he was a good player, and he continues to be decent when he's on the field. But it's not like he's an all-pro sack artist. It's not like teams or something like, oh no, Chris Long's there, let's double team him. We still got pressure up the middle with Brockers and Donald, and regardless of the fact Hayes are going to be playing opposite, Quinn is still the number 2 defensive end for fantasy purposes. Obviously, J.J. Watt showed, despite the scheme change, he's still more than capable of putting up plenty of stats.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, you're not going to panic here. I hear, oh, they're going to double team him. All right, well, what are you going to do with Donald? What are you going to do with Brockers? Hazel, I mean, these guys, Hayes is no slouch. He could probably start on a handful of teams in the league right now. So
sorry, a handful. I love the slide, Jake. Just a handful of teams would start him, Ross.
Well, I have big hands. So either way, it's fine. No worries whatsoever. Again, look at some of these other guys. All right, Muhammad Wilkerson. Okay, he didn't have anything on the stat sheet. He was awesome. Okay, watch the game. It's going to come. Lamar Houston, he was awesome. Who else? Cameron Jordan. Don't drop Cameron Jordan. You drafted these guys for a reason. Calais Campbell, you drafted these guys for a reason. Stick with it. But if you may have missed on a couple players, we mentioned Cliff Averill earlier. Okay, not a lot of tackles, but yeah, he's going to get some sacks this year, especially with Chris Clemens out of the mix. Averill's going to have a much more prominent role. So if he's out there and you need to replace somebody, he's a guy. But Ross, another name, an even bigger name, I think, and I was up, then I was down, now I'm back up again on this guy, Jarrell Casey. He's the real deal. What are your thoughts of Jarrell Casey coming out of week one?
Well, I'm still a little bit nervous, Jeff, about the scheme. I need to go back and have a closer look at the Tennessee game and really watch Casey in particular, because he is a player who, at one point in the off-season, he was being pushed right up there towards, DL1 territory, which I was never on board with that higher push. But then suddenly, we started talking about how Darnell Dockett never thrived in Ray Horton's scheme, and that's exactly what they're going to be expecting from Casey, and he's no longer going to be a one-gap pass rusher. And all those things were really shaking up the fantasy landscape, or at least around Casey, and he plummeted. He absolutely plummeted. Like, you could definitely get him outside the top 30 ends, defensive lineman, in several leagues, in many leagues. But yeah, now he's on the rise again. I don't know. I mean, when players are yo-yoing around like this, of course you want to buy them when they're at their absolute low, but sometimes I tend to sort of just steer clear and let the dust settle. But I just wanted to touch back on the idea of dropping these players for people. The way I phrased it to a guy on Twitter today was, are you going to drop Des Bryant and pick up Hearns? The answer is no. No one is doing that. And that's exactly what you've just asked me for an IDP question. I'm not saying that, Dunlap or whoever, Calais Campbell is an equivalent to Des Bryant, but that's the kind of thing you're talking about doing. You're talking about dropping elite players for out of nowhere risers based on one game, and that's not going to win you any fantasy football championships.
Yeah, I mean the Jason Pierre-Paul. I mean that when we were asked that, yeah, that's should I drop Jamal Charles for Mark Ingram? No, please. I mean, or yeah, do it, and then can I be in your league next year? I mean, what do you want to? No, don't do it. You're getting me very fired up here, and likewise. Ross, one other question, and this is sort of a meta question. I've been kicking this around. I mean, we had to kind of deal with this 2 years ago with Geno Atkins, and then now this year. I mean, we obviously were both high on Gerald McCoy coming into this year. We knew the system was a great fit. We know that he's an ascending, almost ascendant player, and he went out and he put up a big week one stat line. Now, the question ultimately is, where do we sort of draw the line? Because, conventional wisdom says in just DL leagues, you start defensive ends. You don't start defensive tackles. Well, he's putting up starter quality numbers and possibly borderline DL1 numbers, at least initially. Where do we draw that line? Where are you comfortable with a guy like McCoy, who obviously now he's the front runner for this year's elite defensive tackle?
That's a really good question. I'm thinking, I'm pondering. I'm looking at the rankings right now, Jeff. So, okay, we've got Justin Tuck consensus ranked 20 at the minute. You've got him 20. I've got him 22. Nate's got him 20. Where do we stand? Are we saying McCoy over Tuck? I think that's pretty much my breaking point, right around here, because other players, Sheldon Richardson's around here, Jared Allen's around this area, Cliff Averill. He's definitely right in this mix. The thing about McCoy is he's probably a little bit safer for the tackles than most of these guys, because people will just run up the middle, and they're expecting pressure from the edges. So he has got to potentially get 10 sacks and 50 tackles, and if he does that, he's going to be very, very relevant in many fantasy leagues. So yeah, bottom of the DL2 tier. I'd love to push him a bit higher, but I don't think on a weekly start basis I can do that.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm right in the same area with you in terms of rankings, but it's tempting, especially when you're talking the potential for double-digit sacks with his tackle floor. It's really intriguing. It's something to pay close attention to. I know a lot of people are kind of grappling with that decision this week after I'm sure McCoy went undrafted in most leagues. he's right there among the league leaders. So an intriguing question. And see, we're always pondering these things, and there's never really a right. If like I always say, if any one of us, if I have all of the right answers, do you really think that I'd be doing this? I'd be using all of those right answers to dominate high stakes leagues and et cetera. Like, we don't have the right answers. We're asking the right questions, though, and we're trying to find those answers throughout the course of the season, and we're trying to put this puzzle together. And Ross, some of the puzzle came together at least a little bit in Arizona. I have to admit, I think generally across the board, a number of us were just far too low on Larry Foote. It looks like he's going to be a decent option. Are there any other players like that, or maybe your thoughts on Foote in general? But some of these guys, maybe, okay, we entered the season maybe a little low on. Now, hey, they're legit, and they should be owned, and they should be starters in a lot of fantasy leagues.
Yeah, I mean, for me, he's another one of those guys. If you're a value IDP drafter, you don't care about the sexy picks. You don't need a Levante David or a Von Miller or a Bowman. Foot is, he's not in their tier, but he is going to put up points for you, and you can do a damn good job in fantasy leagues by being smart and picking up those guys right at the end of your drafts. So if he's out there on a waiver wire, go and get him. Just get him on the roster. Another guy who's a bit like that for me is Brad Jones. He's a guy who people are talking about dropping because he had a poor week. But again, he's the every down linebacker in Green Bay. He's the guy you want to own. A couple of guys who I think I may be undervalued. Corey Legit in San Diego. Obviously, he put up a sack. He was really tearing it up at the end of the preseason. 5 total tackles as well last week. Comes up against Seattle this week, so maybe he dips a little bit and maybe he gets dropped if anyone's picked him up, but he's definitely a guy I'm paying closer attention to moving forward.
Yeah, certainly probably got more or not even questions, just straight up comments from people like, oh, nice call on Brad Jones. It was the whole team, with the exception of maybe Mike Daniels, that looked awful. Not to say that, hey, it wasn't a good call for last week, that's for sure. But I don't know if we see that continually. We saw a lot of rust in week 1. I mean, look, Kenny Vaccaro missed 6 tackles. He missed 3 all last year. He missed 6. He led all, I guess if you want to say led, he led the league in missed tackles. I don't know if that's something you want to lead the league in, but he was rusty. Jones was rusty. There was some rust on some players, certainly. Jamie Collins, even though he put up a good stat line, looked a little kind of rusty out there, at least to start. So, just be patient. Don't go and cut an every down linebacker just because he had a bad week. It's going to happen, and you got to kind of have to roll with the punches. But there are other situations that maybe you weren't aware of coming into the season that you really do need to be aware of. Ross, Roman Harper played 18 snaps, and this was by plan. Charles Godfrey rotated in. I don't think you can roster Harper at all. And then the other one, too, is that despite starting, quote-unquote starting, Dejon Buchanan only played about roughly 60% of the Cardinals' snaps. So, if you're trying to roll with either of these guys in the safety spot, you might want to look elsewhere, at least for now. I'm moving away from Harper kind of altogether. Ross, are there players like that you notice that you're kind of fading now after what we kind of saw from week 1?
Yeah, I'm going to say no one's jumping off the page at me, Jeff, just because I like to be calm after week 1. I didn't have the best of week 1s, to be honest, but, the season isn't lost in week 1. I could lose all my games in week 1. If I win in week 16 and win my fantasy championship, week 1 is irrelevant. I'm looking through the stats. I'm taking my time. If duck eggs are never good, but if you get less than 4 total tackles, if you're a middle linebacker, that's also never good. Keeping stock of snap counts. One of the things in Buffalo, and obviously people were trying to work out what Preston Brown, Nigel Bradham moving forward. Obviously people who own Koa Misi are gutted. He was a guy we were tipping up, and he's just got injured. So there are plenty of guys out there that didn't do what you expected in week 1, and that's commonplace throughout every fantasy league, throughout every team. So I'm just saying, don't overreact. Give it at least 2 or 3 weeks before you really cut shit on performance. Although, like Jeff says, when you're seeing players like Harper or Buchanan, when it's their snap count, that's a different matter altogether. Snap count is something you need to take very seriously, even in week 1. Stat production is something you can be a little bit calmer about.
Absolutely, very well said. And if you are curious of who's playing where, especially at linebacker, well, I'm only doing linebackers. I don't want to It takes me forever to do just the linebackers, but I am going to keep a 3-down linebacker chart, which I'll be posting every week, somewhere in the midweek, probably Wednesdays each week is where kind of right where I get that analysis all crystallized. I'll give you a little bit of observations. Most of the time it's not going to change, but this week, obviously, with all the injuries, there was a good chunk of observations there on what you can expect. And this chart will be beneficial as you go to maybe make some drop ads or something along those lines, just in constructing your roster throughout the season. Now, Ross, I'm going to finish things up this week, as we always do on the IDP version of the Fantasy Slant, with who we like and who we don't like. Good matchups, bad matchups. I almost hesitate to call them matchups necessarily in week 1 or week 2 with just week 1's data, because we don't really know yet. I really don't think we'll get a good sense until around about a month into the season. But I'm going to kick things off, and I mentioned earlier that, hey, I like Eric Berry a lot going forward. Again, possibly this year's Barry Church, and of anybody on the Chiefs, he's the one who benefits the most from the Derek Johnson injury. Now he gets the offensive, juggernaut of the Denver Broncos. Barry is my number 1 defensive back for week 2. Ross, a player you like?
Ziggy Ansah. I got to see a bit of the Detroit game, and he left me very, very impressed. He was causing a lot of pressure. He was getting plenty of highlights. He's a guy I'm going to be moving up my rankings slightly. I had him just outside the DL1 tier, but I'm probably going to start slipping him just inside. Someone like he's probably going to leapfrog Campbell and Houston. Although I still like those players, he's a guy I'm going to move up slightly.
I'll just roll through my other 3 players I like for this week and then toss it back over to you. I do like Everson Griffin this week against New England, because the New England offensive line looked absolutely horrible in week 1, so that's a player you're going to obviously want to roll with there. I love Dante Whitner against New Orleans. I love Dante Whitner in general. Dante Whitner is now a DB1, okay? Mm-hmm. This guy, hey, if Eric Berry is in contention to lead the defensive backs and tackles this season, right there with Church, then so is Dante Whitner. So a great play against New Orleans. And Ross, you just mentioned, I do like Nigel Bradham. It's a riskier play. But, hey, Brandon Spikes did not play every down last week. If you own Brandon Spikes, sorry, my bad. We missed on that one. He's not looking like an every down player. I don't know if it's the knee injury. I don't know if the coaching staff saw something they didn't like. But he's not. It was Preston Brown out there every down. So that was Bradham's spot. Signs point to Bradham playing every down this week at home with the most tackle-friendly stats crew against a run-heavy offense. I mean, can this get any better? I wouldn't be surprised if Bradham's the number 1 player. Now, I'm not going to rank him there, but, hey, this guy offers tons of upside in week 2. Ross, other players you like this week?
One of the guys I am downgrading quite a lot is Von Miller, who did not jump off the screen to me at all watching the Broncos play last week. He just looked like he was rusty and a little bit sluggish. He needs some time to warm up. This is a guy who, even in more balanced scoring systems, as a sack artist, can push to be a top 5 guy. This is a guy who is incredible when he's at full tilt, but he's not at full tilt and he's not close. So he's definitely getting moved down my rankings. I don't probably be right down to the bottom of the linebacker 2 tier right now. Hitting on Whitner, he is a guy I really, really like as well. Obviously, I picked him up in a lot of leagues, drafted him, towered him. 13 total tackles last week. Although I did notice something slightly, weird, was the fact he's played less than 20% of his snaps within 8 yards of line of scrimmage on run plays, which I was just surprised by, knowing how he has played before and in San Francisco, and knowing his frequency for putting up tackles. Otherwise, generally, Jeff, like I'm saying, I'm just not overreacting to anything. We've only got 1 week of data. It's difficult basing your stuff off last year. So generally, where I was pre-season, unless anything dramatic has happened, I'm not really revising it in any major way.
Any other players you don't like for week 1?
Ooh, just the whole Rams offense. It's not relevant, but yeah, hang my head in shame.
All right, well, let me roll through my my do not starts, my no flies, or maybe not necessarily do not starts, but I'm certainly downgrading them for the week. going to start with Earl Thomas. It's just not going to happen. I know everybody loves it. Hey, he's awesome. He's awesome on the field, but last year's production was an anomaly. It's more Cam Chancellor and more Cam Chancellor and more Cam Chancellor. So what we saw last week is a good indicator of what we're going to see out of Thomas for this season. And how do I know that? Not basing it on 1 week. I'm basing it on the second half of last year. You know, if you look at it from the second half of last year, he was not a DB1. So sorry if you drafted him in that spot. We tried to warn you. We had him outside our top 10 for that very reason. And I don't like this matchup against San Diego. Rob Ninkovich did not play every down last week. In fact, he only played about 50% of snaps. Dante Hightower played every down at outside linebacker. That is not good as well, folks. Boy, oh boy, this could be bad if you drafted Ninkovich as your DL1. We'll have to see. I mean, I'm not saying it could, you know, we know Belichick could be a product of his game plan for the week, and that could change this week. But if we see it again this week against Minnesota, oh boy, I'm jumping off Ninkovich very, very quickly. I don't like playing him in this matchup just because of what we saw last week. It's very dangerous. You're playing with fire potentially with Ninkovich. I hope I'm wrong. I really do, but it doesn't look promising. Brad Jones, we mentioned earlier, until he puts it together, don't drop him. But until he puts it together, don't get him on the field for your fantasy roster either. And then finally, Wallace Gilberry, I mentioned him earlier. Yeah, he got the 1.5 sacks. Okay. But like I said, he only had the 2 pressures. And really, the ceiling isn't monstrously high there. Also, go back and watch. I mean, Atlanta's not the same team they were offensively as last year. They're a lot better off this year. And Matt Ryan, good protection, was able to get the ball out when he needed to and really avoided pretty much most of the pressure last week. I'd expect to see a very similar performance, even though, yes, okay, it's not in the safety of the dome. It's still just tough to trust him over somebody like, one of these DL1 or upside DL2s. Gilbert's still in that sort of DL3 territory, and Margus Hunt is still breathing down his neck. So I'm not trusting that necessarily this week. Ross, any final thoughts for the listeners going into week 2?
Keep strong. Don't make any crazy decisions on the waiver wire. Maybe this is the time to start floating some trades around. People get antsy. Be the level head in your league. Take advantage of people. Don't be taken advantage of.
Keep strong and carry on. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We'll be back for another one next week. So for Pro Football Focus, he's Ross Miles. I'm Jeff Ratcliffe, and that's a wrap.